Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Interesting story for you today. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Banks have no idea who's creditworthy anymore. This is by Anna Maria Andreatis. Banks have pulled back sharply on lending to U.S. consumers during the coronavirus crisis. One reason they can't tell who is creditworthy anymore. Millions of Americans are out of work and behind on their debts. But in many cases, the missed payments aren't reflected in their credit scores, nor are they uniformly recorded on borrowers' credit reports. The confusion stems from a provision in the government's coronavirus stimulus package. The law says lenders that allow borrowers to defer their debt payments can't report those payments as late to credit reporting companies. From March 1st through the end of May, Americans deferred debt payments on more than 100 million accounts, according to credit reporting firm TransUnion, a sign of widespread financial distress. The credit blind spot has further clouded the outlook for lenders. For years, strong consumer spending and borrowing helped propel them to record profits. Now the economy is in shambles, and they are trying to figure out what is going to happen to all of the debt Americans have racked up in better times. Lenders that are having a tough time spotting risky loan applicants are approving fewer borrowers for credit cards, auto loans, and other consumer debt. They are also hunting for new data sets that could indicate who is in financial trouble and how much they need to set aside to cover soured loans. The Federal Reserve last week said the biggest U.S. banks could be saddled with as much as $700 billion in loan losses in a prolonged downturn. Without accurate information, their only option is to pull back on credit, said Michael Abbott, head of banking for North America at consulting firm Accenture plc. Banks don't know who is going to pay and who isn't. It's like flying blind into a credit storm. Okay, there's more on this article. I'd certainly encourage you to read the rest of it, but that will give you the gist of what we're talking about today. So now let's apply our lens and take a look at this, as is our wont, from a values perspective and cultural perspective. I was at Bank of America during the financial crisis. In fact, I moved over to the mortgage business during that crisis to help kind of clean up the mess that was left over from the Countrywide acquisition. One of the things that was impressed upon me by the leaders in that business was that mortgages had always been the most boring part of banking. And the reason for this was simple. People would always pay their mortgages first. No matter what happened, keeping a roof over their head was a priority. They would pay their mortgage. If they didn't, it was a bankruptcy. They couldn't pay their mortgage. Well, it became more exciting, if you will, because the federal government started pulling out all the stops during the Clinton administration to increase home ownership. So Fannie and Freddie got super aggressive. Fannie and Freddie are kind of intended to be lower income mortgage loans. So smaller homes, but also they're targeting a demographic that has a higher risk of not being able to pay simply because their available income is lower. So what happened was they inflated a housing bubble. The banks at the time were very worried about the prospect of being taken over by foreign banks, hostile takeovers. The way you stave off a hostile takeover is you have lots of cash on hand, so that if you need to, you can buy your own stock or whatever. You can reject cash offers. A big part in the run-up to the financial crisis was that under Basel II, we were looking at the prospect of those banks which could prove that they were managing their risk well would be allowed to reserve less cash against defaults and et cetera, et cetera. They could effectively lend more of it out. This offered a great advantage to those companies who were willing to do it because it was, in effect, like free money that you could use to generate profit while not exposing yourself to hostile takeover because your reserve requirement was lower. So that was the path we were all on right up until the eve of the financial crisis. And what had happened in the interim was that the federal government was pressuring banks to say, in Bank of America terms, the phrase was say yes more often. What it meant was make riskier loans. They would go zip code by zip code and look at the demographics of those zip codes and see how many loans you had made to those zip codes. And if you weren't making enough loans in the eyes of the federal government to majority, minority zip codes, you would get in trouble with the regulators. And specifically, what the federal government threatened was that you would not be allowed to grow through acquisition. They would not approve your acquisitions. If you're not keeping lots of cash on hand because you're looking to lend it out to make more profit, then the way you defend yourself against hostile takeover is by growing bigger. And so you saw over this period from 1996 with the Credit Reinvestment Act up through 2008, what you saw was banks getting bigger, more consolidation, right? To protect themselves. Well, now the federal government was threatening your ability to do that, which meant you were likely going to get taken over. So the banks were very sensitive to this charge and bent over backwards to make loans that weren't the best loans. They had a lot of risk. Now, here's the problem, is because mortgages have historically been such a safe investment, you have a pile of these things now, and you're making more and more of these to people who aren't getting their income checked. Why aren't they getting their income checked? Because you're being told by the federal government to say yes more often, and if you do a standard verification of income on the person you're going to loan the money to, they're going to fail it. And if they fail it, you're not going to lend to them. And so you're not going to say yes more often, your numbers aren't going to improve, and the federal government's going to come down on you with the full weight that the regulator can bring. So what you do instead is what a lot of mortgage origination companies did, which was they stopped doing verification of income. That meant that you had no way of knowing now who could pay the mortgage and who couldn't. At the same time, because the money is freer, people are getting into, you may have seen it in the news at the time, McMansions. They're being offered homes and financing on those homes well beyond their current ability to pay, on the assumption they would tell you this. Oh, yeah, don't buy a home based on how much you're making now, but on how much you're making 10 and 20 and 30 years from now. That's ridiculous. You have no idea what you're going to be making then. But this was useful to tell young people who were at the beginning of their careers because, of course, they only thought that they were going to continue to see their income grow. And so it would sucker them into buying more house than they could afford. And this would lead builders to build bigger houses than they could afford and more of them. And this is how the housing bubble got inflated. So you would have people in these big McMansions, more house than they could afford today, and you have no real way of knowing it because you didn't do a verification of income on them. You have people who would literally buy a house and get a jumbo on the same property, same day. This was very common in California, for example. And so now you have a bunch of these loans out there, and you don't know which of these are going to default. Historically, the default rate is very low. The foreclosure rate is very low. So the only thing you know is I've got all these loans, and maybe, 5% of them, 1 in 20, is going to not pay at some point during its life. The rest are all fine. So what do you do? Well, what the banks did was they took those loans that were more dubious and they bundled them together to basically spread the risk. Since we can't identify, because we don't have verification of income, since we don't know which of these loans are likeliest to fail, we're going to just treat them as a pool. And we'll sell securities based on that pool. Okay. This is where you may have heard about them. They were called derivatives, right? It was a way to service a bunch of loans in an area that you didn't have a lot of history with because it was really kind of on the bottom end of your market, and you didn't have a lot of data about because you weren't allowed, for whatever reason, to do a normal verification of income. The reason I mention all of this, aside from the fact that it was a very painful crisis to go through, the reason I mention all this is because that situation is what the banks are now in, only it's bigger. Because now we're not just talking about mortgages, we're talking about everything. This unemployment that was out of left field and government dictated because of the lockdowns, with no end in sight in some of these states, because they keep changing and moving the goalpost by which they'll allow the country to reopen. All that uncertainty leads to the banks not being able to quantify how much risk they have. And so if you were in a situation like we were in for the longest time with the mortgages, where it was a core value of the American people that one of the ways that you develop wealth is by purchasing a home, owning a home, building equity in your home, improving your home, and then over time, you've created wealth, right? Because once you've got to the point where you paid off your mortgage, the home is yours free and clear. You only have to pay the property taxes and upkeep on it, basically. And at the time you go to sell that property, generally speaking, it's worth more than you put into it. You've created wealth. That was a core value. And for the American public, that old Puritan value of frugality reigned for most of our history. It was, don't be a spendthrift. Don't waste your money. Do you remember Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac, right? Neither a borrower nor a lender be. It's one of the phrases that were constantly repeated. The notion was you want to be smart with your money, and you want to be frugal, you want to live within your means, and over time you will develop wealth and improve the lot of your family. That was the American way to move ahead for most of our history. But easy credit, such as we've had really since the 80s, has shifted that value. Now you'll hear people say things like YOLO, you only live once. What does YOLO mean? It means don't worry about tomorrow, live for today. And so if someone's offering you a loan or a credit card or whatever, it's very tempting to take it, get the enjoyment out of whatever you've got today, and pay later. You remember that in the Popeye cartoons of the 50s and 60s, there was a character called Wimpy. And Wimpy used to come up to Popeye all the time and say, I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. So the notion was you would buy him a hamburger. He would pay you back on Tuesday. Tuesday never came, but he would eat the hamburger. And we've all kind of become wimpies in the last couple of generations because of the easy access to credit. And so many households now are absolutely underwater with debt that they can't pay. And the way you get there is by having that YOLO attitude. If we still had the neither a borrower nor a lender be attitude, it would be much easier for banks to assess the risks and know, because they could count on the fact that people would pay back what they owed. It was just a core value. It was a piece of integrity, which we valued highly, a piece of your reputation, which we valued highly. If you were known to be somebody who welched on a debt, that was a bad thing. You were considered to be immoral, not fit for good company, that sort of thing. That's all gone. And so that's left the banks with a big problem. Now, here's the other side of it that you need to be aware of, wherein I don't buy that this is as big a problem as the banks are saying. And the reason for that is simple. Is also since the financial crisis, the banks have shifted their values. As I mentioned, up until the financial crisis, the focus was how do we free up money to make money? Because in the bank, when you're in banking, that's what you're selling. You're selling money, right? And then after the financial crisis, it shifted to how do we protect ourselves over the long term. And so there is a very telling metric you can look at. If you go out to the St. Louis Fed, which is where a lot of the data on the economy is collected in America, go out to the St. Louis Fed. There's a system there, it's called FRED, available to the public. What you want to look for is something called excess reserves of depository institutions. What does that mean? That means that this is money that these institutions hold over and above what the federal government requires them to hold to mitigate the risk that they have. So as you can imagine, for most of American history, that number was zero. Why? Banks were in the business selling money. They didn't want to have essentially an inventory of money that they would keep on hand. They wanted to put it all out there in loans. Well, come 2008, that changed. And what you saw was very quickly that number across the system spiked to about $2.5 trillion. Okay? It started coming down right around the time of the 2016 election. You see it start really coming down. So it got down to maybe 1.5 trillion of that was out. As soon as this pandemic hit, it spiked again, and now we're back up to about 2.5 trillion. Here's the other thing. If you look at the government spending we've had, you'll recall a couple of things. One is that during the Obama administration, the national debt clock froze for months and months and months because there was a spending cap put on it by Congress, and yet the government kept spending, and this number never went up. So how was that possible? Well, what happened was, instead of offering bonds for this debt, which is the normal practice, you may recall stories in the 90s in particular, and early 2000s, of the Chinese buying a lot of U.S. bonds, essentially buying up our debt. Well, that stopped for the most part post-financial crisis. And so the way they funded the bailouts and everything that they did was that it was actually the banks who bought the bonds. And you can see this in these reserves. When you say, what are those reserves made of? A lot of them are bond purchases. Now, the federal government then came to the banks and started fining the banks for their behavior in the run-up to the financial crisis. Billions of dollars in fines. And yet, you would see the banks absorb these fines and not really protest very much. Why was that? Because they were paying them out of those bond reserves. So there's this little three-card Monte game going between the federal government and the banks, where the federal government, the politicians, and the regulators get to posture like they're hammering the banks, and the banks get to basically absorb the hit without any penalty because it's all coming out of excess reserves. Okay? Moreover, the benefit of those excess reserves sitting not just in banks and depository institutions, but also in corporations' coffers, because big corporations did the exact same thing. The benefit of having that money there is that it doesn't hit the street in the form of inflation until later. So that means the government can spend a fortune on bailouts and stimulus and what have you, and the bill is not going to come due until probably after the administration that incurred it. And that's exactly what happened. That Obama was long gone by the time that money started hitting the street and inflation started to creep up. We've just spent a ton of money on stimulus packages and that sort of thing because of the pandemic. Where do you think that money is physically? Where do you think it is? It's in the excess reserves. And so that money is kind of behind a dam, if you will. And the water pressure is building. The water's getting higher and higher and higher. At some point, it's going to overtop that dam, and that money's going to start leaking out. And that's when you're going to see hyperinflation. Because the money, in effect, what we've done is we've printed a bunch of money that we haven't really accounted for, right? And the accounting comes due once that money starts actively flowing through the economy. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. You've got the Byzantine policies of the Fed and the zero interest rate policies extended for forever, it looks like. You've got the banks and the way they're monetizing the federal debt, which is going to play out. You've got all this risk that's out there that nobody knows how to deal with. But I predict what's ultimately going to happen is there'll be a bunch of defaults. The banks will absorb the defaults through the money that was pumped into them via this monetization of the debt. Because mind you, the banks didn't have to buy this. It was basically given to them by the federal government when they couldn't make them, sell the debt on the bond market. So keep an eye on those things. In the future, you'll have a good insight as to why these large macroeconomic indicators are going to start moving the way they are. But what I predict you're going to see, probably not until maybe middle of the next administration, you're going to see inflation start to take off as the banks try to right their own ships by taking some of that money and circulating it in the form of new loans. But again, I think it's going to take a couple of years for that to play out. So we're seeing them gripe now about it. They're basically raising the warning flags that, hey, there's another bubble that is being created here. There's some good in them doing that, but keep a close eye on it for the sake of your own portfolio and for your own peace of mind. Have a great day.